Michael, it seems absurd to say this after so many years, but welcome to Waterstones.
Thank you very much indeed. Lovely to be up here again, looking at this wonderful view.
We have an amazing view of London, but of course, you might even hear the jackhammer in the background. This is a metropolis, but you're going to take us somewhere far more rural and far more beautiful. The book Spring does take us to your home, where you have been living for many, many years. And I wondered if you could maybe set the scene, tell us where we are and what kind of place Devon River Country is.
Well, it's interesting. A place is mixed with history, because I'm only down in this place because my wife dragged me down there. I didn't want to go in the first place at all. But she grew up, she had some growing up in outside a little village called Iddesleigh, which is in the middle of nowhere. No one knows where it is. It's equidistant almost between Exmoor and Dartmoor, so you can see Dartmoor from the village and from our cottage. So she fell in love with this place when she was very little. And then much later on, after I'd had my childhood and youth and she'd had her childhood and youth, and we were both teachers, we wanted to start a project called Farms for City Children, to get kids from the cities, London, Manchester, Birmingham, Bristol, all over, primary school children to come to be in the countryside, to live on a farm, to work on a farm and experience wildlife really for the first time. So walk on the wild side really for kids. So that's what we've been doing for 50 years. And basically, I didn't want to go. You know, I was teacher, quite happy being teacher, really. Actually, that's not true. I had some good happy times and some non-happy times. But it was my wife's idea. I thought it was inspired to, in a way, expose children to this extraordinary place which city children really have never been in before. Not just the wildlife, but the animal life and the work and the people, the food, everything really about it. And it's worked, and we've had about 100,000 children come there now. And it's a place of dreams for us, really. So we're still living there. And we stopped going out on the farm and working now because we're kind of a tiny bit too old for that these days, and wonderful other people do it. But the children still come, which means that I'm there, living there, writing away, whatever I'm doing, and they're coming past all the time, and you hear them in the fields, you hear them talking and laughing, and they're as much part of our life really as the animals themselves, the farm animals, and indeed the countryside. So it is a hugely familiar place. Thomas Hardy talked about the familiarity really of the countryside, if you know it well. He called it the old association, which is a marvellous expression. And it's the association which you can only get by being there and being there and being there, and actually beginning to know who planted the trees, who dug the ditches, you know, who's buried in the graveyard, whose photograph is in the village hall, and the stories and the people that are still there, who are the sons and the daughters, the ones, all that is the old association. And it's, I know we feel, Claire and I feel very privileged that we're part of that lineage, if you like, of a village, of a place. So it's deep in our hearts, this place. And I mean, I've written about it in my fictional stories a lot. Warhorse began in the pub in the village through an old soldier who come back from the First World War and aged 80 and many years later just told me he'd been to the First World War with horses. And that's the village. It's someone who walked out of that village and went off. And then the very cottage we're living in was lived in then, at the time of the First World War, which I now know because of the old association. I know lived there. But I know also that a young man walked out of the cottage door and walked off down the lane to join up and never came back. So you know the stories of the people who actually slept in the room that you sleep in. So the place is what really my story of Spring is all about. Only what wonderful publishers Hodder decided was that they were going to get 4 writers to do the 4 seasons. And I like this really. They gave me seniority because I'm old. And they said to me, which would you like first? That's what they told me anyway. I think actually what had happened, they were praying because all the other seasons had gone. And they were praying I chose Spring anyway because that's what I wanted. And Spring was coming along. But the wonderful thing really was that it made me look much harder at the landscape I walk in. And I have a daily walk. I have had for some time, really since we stop working on the farm, and it's, I don't know, anything up to about 5 to 8 kilometres a day. It's not long, but it's really round the farm. And I go roughly the same way. I go in different directions, but it's the same sort of walk. And by and large, I do it. And when I'm doing it, usually I'm thinking of stories I'm concocting, and you know, I tell the first people who ever hear my stories are the sheep I'm walking past. You know, they don't look at all impressed, but I keep telling them, and it's very good because I get to speak out loud some ideas which are floating around. Well, I found myself not doing that because I knew what I was having to do was to look and to see and to hear and to smell in a way that was relatively new because it had another purpose. For years and years, I'd done it with 35, 40 children, you know, on a Sunday walk going around the farm, and then I'd be stopping them and telling them about the flowers and you know, the otter spraits down by the river, and picking up a bit of otter poo and saying, have a sniff of that, and that sort of thing. But it was always for the children. It was me showing them. Teachers have to do this all the time, and actually what it stops you doing is doing it yourself, just for yourself. And this book did that. It made me think again, and it's the reflections that during the walk which were really about the countryside around me and what it had meant not just to me, but for generations of people. This old association thing came back and back and back, and I knew I was walking in the footsteps of people I'd known and have loved, who are no longer here. And then I think of my grandchildren I've also done the walks with, and them rolling down the hill. There were all sorts of happinesses and sadnesses which came as I was walking along. But it made me think harder and think deeper. So I'm not going to offer back to Hodder the royalties they're paying me, but it's been of great benefit to me to write the book.
Be very careful of what you say.
I don't know.
You're on a verbal contract. I'm really pleased you mentioned the Farms for City Children, because there's a lovely, I suppose it's a metaphor really, where you talk about the fact that the saplings that some of those children plant, of course, grow and flourish just as they do through the experiences that they have down there, which is very much what spring is all about, seeing things finally growing and being the best they can be. And those saplings, of course, will become trees. And there's a lovely bit where you're talking about how you walk through the woods and you talk to those trees. You have a really close relationship with those trees because they sort of almost feel like they're yours. They see you more than anybody else. Tell me a little bit about that connection, because it's such a lovely thing.
Well, it links up to a little bit what I said before, where I walk past things. And I suppose that now the first time I ever really did this was that I was looking at a tree I was walking past in the wood. I think it was autumn, actually, before this all happened, really. And I noticed the wrinkles in the skin of the tree. And as you get to 80 and beyond, you'll be noticing wrinkles in your own bark. And I liked that, but it also made me think much more of these trees as fellow creatures. And they move, they sway, they roar, they whisper, and you know all the time there is life down there. And the wonderful thing about spring, for instance, is that you know they're feeling. Again, it's time, hibernation's over. You're waking up again, and then it's the signs of the trees, in a way, catching new life. It's very beautiful and it's very moving. And because I honestly do know, on the track I go, I know every single one of these trees. I've tripped over many of the branches. They live time and time again. Hurt my shoulder very badly once doing that, and cursed the tree. But I know every badger hole, and I know every tree. And I've felt a kinship I'd never felt before. So when I was with the children, my own children, and indeed the children who came from the cities, I never put my arms around a tree at all, but you're alone. And you can do, it's private, you know, it's personal. And you can really feel the life in them, you feel the age in them, the strength in them, and the connection. Above all, this story, you can call it that, the book, is about connection. It's about connection to the world around you, and I felt that reinforced, and so I hadn't felt it before for some years. partly because I'd spent too much time, I think, telling stories around it and interpreting it. I wasn't doing that this time. I was just doing it because I knew that's what this thing was all about, feeling it again. So I was feeling it under my feet, this wood, slipping about with the leaves crunching and the nuts crunching and all that sort of thing. And then you catch a glimpse of a deer down the bottom there, and instead of actually saying, "Oh, it's nice, I'll tell people when I get home," you stand and stare. And it's the stopping and standing and staring and having the time to do it and the inspiration to do it, was wonderful and funny too. I mean, there's nothing so funny as deer taking you by surprise. You look up and you see two bottoms, and they're both white, and you want them to stay forever. And then they start bobbing away, and you want to call them to come back, but they're gone. And it's these moments, you have to catch the moments. And I found time and time again I was catching moments and interacting with nature going on around me. There's one moment in the book, which is one moment where you're part of a drama, again, which I would have walked by normally. I was just more intrigued by it than usual. But there was an incident which I was involved in, which was a duck. And all it was, I was walking past a hedgerow, and very strangely, a duck flew up out of the middle of the hedge, and quacking and quacking and quacking, and flew off. Well, that's odd, because it was 200 metres at least from the river. And then Dumbo here, I thought, well, of course, it's sitting on eggs, And then I did the wrong thing. I went to look. And there are 9 lovely white eggs in this mallard, flying around and flying around. I knew, seeing me there. And then I'm thinking slowly, because I'm stupid, actually you shouldn't have stopped. You shouldn't have frightened her off her eggs just for your own curiosity. Not that I knew she was there, but get out of there. You're just making it worse. So I went on my way as quick as I could and walked down along the river, all the time looking back to be sure that the duck came back, and the duck kept flying round and round and round. And I looked round after a while, and the heron took off from the river. And then I knew that this whole thing, the duck had seen me, the heron had seen me. The heron must have seen me going to exactly that spot. Whereas the next time I walked by, there were no eggs left at all. So you kind of interfered simply by being an observer and getting too close to it, being insensitive about it. So there were incidents like that, and seeing things I'd never seen before. I'd seen otter spraints all the time with the children. It's lovely because they stink and they love to say, yeah, horrible, horrible. You're saying, well, of course, what do you think it's smelling of? And I know, sir. I say, well, smell it. And they'd say, fish. I said, that's because they eat fish. They eat eels. Eels? Where are the eels? I said, down there. And you can't see them, but they're down there. So all that sort of thing. But I don't think I'd ever seen, in all the 45 years or whatever it was up until that time, I don't think I'd actually seen an otter. I'd seen a mink, because there were one or two mink there, but I don't think I could genuinely come back and say, I've seen an otter. And then I had this just extraordinary moment walking along where I was looking for kingfishers, because you do occasionally see them flashing along. And I was stood still, and I saw this ring of water. And I thought, well, that's a fish jumping, because that's what they usually are. And sure enough, a fish came up. And I thought, hang on, it's not a fish. They haven't got shiny backs that are doing that. That's not a fish, that's an otter. So you're stood there, absolutely still, not moving a muscle. And I thought, oh God, this is just great. Come up again. And it came up again. And it came up again. And I stood there. And suddenly I realized that this was not spotting an otter. This was the otter spotting me.
Yeah.
And actually saying to me, I don't care. You stay here, there, I'll stay here. And every time it came up, it had some sort of shelly fish. It was crackling and had its little paws going up and down again. And I then said, we must counted, and 80 times this thing came up and down, up and up and down. And then suddenly it didn't come back. And you were left feeling as alone as I've ever felt in the world suddenly. So there were moments like this all the way during these walks. The reason that I hope the book works is that I was filling my head and my heart all the time with this place, but doing it in a way which was completely fresh to me again. So when I went back to write, it was to some extent like writing a diary, but it was more, perhaps more considered than a diary, and it wasn't about me. When you're writing a diary, generally speaking, it's about my feelings. Well, actually, it was about the connection. It was always about the connection of the plants and the trees, and looking forward all the time, because it was the slowest, I said a word I shouldn't have said. It was the slowest spring I've ever heard in terms of, it just went on and on and on, clinging to winter all the time. It would not leave winter behind. And it was, infuriatingly, I would leave home for a bit to come to London or somewhere else, and I'd find that there were snowdrops everywhere, there were daffodils everywhere, and cherry blossom. I came up to London for some reason, it doesn't matter what. I was infuriated walking through a park, cherry blossom everywhere. We had nothing, nothing. It's outrageous. It's just they're so privileged in the cities. Anyway, there were things like this that I didn't sit there and just do my walk and be in Devon. I did go elsewhere. I remember going up to Scotland to do a talk in a school by the seaside, and it was uncharacteristically clear blue sky, and flowers everywhere, daffodils everywhere. But it made me think of home. And I was missing home more than usual, because it was such a regular thing to be out walking this countryside again, so that when I got back, things had moved on by 4 or 5 days. So you walk through the woods again, and there'd be no bluebells, not a sign of a bluebell, and suddenly with little green shoots coming up through the leaves from the previous autumn. And you think, this is good, it's going to happen, it's going to happen. But it didn't happen. All the time, it didn't happen. Just it shot up a little bit more, and it shot up a little bit more, but it didn't become a bluebell. And the same thing with the swallows, because as we know, it's a bit corny saying it, but we're all waiting for the swallows to come. Then you know and they wouldn't come, and they wouldn't come. And we know where they come to. We know exactly the telephone wire where they come when they fly in from South Africa, because we've been there all these years. And they sit up there and they consider what they're going to do. And what they've come back for is because they were born in the garage which we put up when we first came to the cottage. They've taken possession of the thing. You don't put in my car, once they come, put the car in there at all. So the car has to stay out for 3 or 4 months. No, it's not, I don't care about the car, but what was really extraordinary about it is that we care about the swallow. That's the point. We want the swallows to come back. And then I tried to work out, well, is this actually the swallow that was here last year? Or as the granddaddy of that one, or the grandma of that one, perished on the way somewhere. Is this the grandson or the granddaughter? But somehow the message has come, this is where you go, this is where it's good. And sure enough, they came in and they started building. And the nice thing about being in Devon is that we have more potholes in the lane in Devon than anywhere else in the entire world. It's unbelievable how many potholes we've got. And they love potholes and a bit of mud. They dip down and pick up muddy water and build their wonderful cuppy nests again. And once they're doing it, you really do feel, actually, this is the long way. You can stop grumbling, Michael. And it's silly to say it, but actually the coming of warmth does fill your heart with a certain kind of hope that you don't feel through winter. Through winter, to some extent, I think we should hibernate. We should do what the bears do, just lie down and snore for 3 months, But there was another thing that happened during the writing of it, which really helped me. I had been involved about a year or so before that with a wonderful violinist, a man called Daniel Pioro, making concerts and things. And I love making concerts which are words and music together. And we've done several of these up and down the country in cathedrals and concert halls and things like that. Carnival of Animals and things like that. And I'd written poetry to go along with it. And Sometimes Claire would read with me, and sometimes I'd read on my own. Sometimes it was an actor friend, but we kind of put concerts together. And he came to me, Daniel, with the idea of doing something which I hadn't heard before, but which was intimately linked to what I was doing with the book, by accident. He knew, which I didn't, that Vivaldi, when he was writing the Four Seasons, had written, you'd almost call them like an instruction manual for each season. He was explaining, I think, to just to the people playing it, what had been his experience which had helped him write the music, what was in his head as he wrote down the notes. And it was no more, it was about 14 lines, something like that. But to take you through the spirit and the movement of each individual season. And Daniel's idea was that instead of it just being a piece of paper which no one's ever read or knows about or cares about, could you somehow translate these, Michael, into poetry, if you can call it that, or a story, if you can call it that, and then we'll have it as part of the concert. So before spring, there's a poem about spring. Before autumn, there's a poem about autumn. I said, well, I'd love to do it. Of course I would. So he sent me the originals, not in Italian, I have to say, but in a very rather bad, flat translation, which I wasn't being asked to do. I was being asked to stick, if you like, to the storytelling in the music, but tell it in a way, I suppose, joining hands with Vivaldi and telling it, which is a rather nice thing to do, join hands with Vivaldi, which I did, and wrote these poems. And in the writing of it, again, it made me think harder about the seasons, not just about the piece of music. And what's really interesting is how in the music, as with the seasons, most of us just take it all for granted.
Yeah.
It's summer, well, of course it's hot. It's spring, it swallows. It's the same old, which is awful. And I only had discovered, I think, how awful it was by writing this book, because if you're in touch with the seasons, really in touch with the rhythm of life, which is the rhythm of our own lives, our springtime, our summer, our autumn, and indeed, as I'm living through now, our winter, last 20 years of life, that made me think about that all the time. And as you're telling the tale to the music and writing these poems, I was thinking of the rhythm of this and how distanced we are from seasons. It's what's so wonderful about the whole series of them. Because what happens to us now is that we hide from seasons. When it's too hot, we put a hat on. And we don't want to get skin cancer, so we stay inside, or we put cream on our face, or whatever. It's become that sort of thing. Or we lie on a beach and worship the sun. And when it's winter, we protect ourselves from cold. We don't feel the cold, protect ourselves. And the rain comes down, we put a hat on. Everything is protecting ourselves from outside. Well, people have always done that. But because they couldn't protect themselves so well, your house was damp, it was cold every single time you went out to work on the farm, or you trudged off to work or whatever, it was cold and your hands got cold, and we didn't have lovely boots that kept us warm and all the rest of it. They were closer to the season. And the more urbanized we become all over the world, the less connection we have with it. And that wonderful music, which the world knows, in every blasted lift you walk into, in every doctor's surgery, we hear this stuff coming up. Pay no attention to it at all. Lovely, 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 lovely. No, the man was living his seasons. He was telling us about his seasons and how he felt about them. And it was such a lesson to me that he'd done this thing. I only had to do it with one. Unfortunately, Hodder chose 3 other writers to do that. I don't know what that's all about. But the interesting thing about it, really for me, was that it made me more season sensitive than I think I've ever been in my life. I still put on my coat when I go out in the wintertime. I'm more conscious of that being older than I ever have been before, in a way. But I am much more conscious that it's out there and it's part of who we are, and we are at the present moment wrecking the rhythm. Yeah. That's another reminder the whole time. We're wrecking the natural rhythm of the world around us and changing it not just for ourselves, mortally, if we're not careful, but for the wildlife around us. And if we, I'm not coming to preach here, but it reminded me of how precious this is, this connection. And if we sever the connection to ourselves, You don't feel these things, you don't care about these things. And if you don't care about these things, why would you care about the otter? Why would you care about the ducks laying eggs in a hedge? Why? So it made me ask questions of myself, is the truth of it. You can't answer them. But to ask the questions is very important in books. And there are no proper answers, but because the life experience is too complicated for neat answers. But what it did give me is some idea of how close we should be, and that generations before me have been walking along those banks. So in literature, for instance, I just happen to have been extraordinarily lucky to live in a place which is virtually unknown to the rest of the world. But because of one man, not me, other writers and poets have walked the banks of the river I walk. Rather more interesting writers than I am. The man who actually did this is a man called Ted Hughes. He's a fairly decent poet. Anyway, he happened to be a near neighbour down there. I happened to, when I was a teacher, have taught him a lot. So in a sense, walking along the river one day over 50 years ago, I saw this hero of mine looming up from under a riverbank with a fishing rod over his shoulder. And he introduced himself, and he became a really good friend with his wife Carol, of Claire and myself, and he became the first president of our charity. He valued it. What was really interesting about Ted Hughes, and learning from writers is so important. He'd been doing what I just did this spring. He'd been doing it all his life. I think Claire had been, actually, my wife had been, because when she came down to Devon as a little girl of 7, there's children who do this, and great poets. They are close to the world around them. So when she came down to stay with her daddy, who incidentally was a fairly decent publisher, a man called Alan Lane, who began Penguin Books, and they used to stay at the pub, which was the origin place of Warhorse. It's all place. Anyway, and so Claire, who was well, it's obvious, she was a very awkward and difficult child, and was her daddy at some point, and Mummy thought, well, what place does she love best in all the world? It's going down to Iddesleigh with her dad. Yeah. But then I think they thought one better. Could she go down by herself and stay in the pub? And Alan Lane happened to know the lady who ran the pub, Peggy Rafferty, and Sean Rafferty, a great poet, and they ran this pub. And to Claire, they were like a granny and a grandpa. She liked them, she liked being with them. I think they quite liked her, but quite liked her out of the pub, because they ran the pub. And so they would say to her after breakfast, off you go, Claire. And she was a suburban girl, more urban than country. And what did she do age 7? She put her wellies on and walked. Well, it was the 1950s, hardly a car around the place, no terrible stories of dreadful people. Off she went. And she, at this height, could discover all the creatures and the creepy crawlies. She did monstrous things, though. She'd collect them. Can you imagine that now? She'd collect them, put them in boxes and put it under the bed. Anyway, she was someone who connected to the world around her intimately when she was young. And she would walk down the lanes and talk to the farmers and groom the horses and help with the lambing. All that stuff happened to her very young. And for Ted Hughes, it was to some extent the same. He lived very close, in a town, but lived very, very close to the moors. So what did he do when he was young? He put on his wellies and off he went. And he walked and lived amongst the wildlife. And his eyes were just opened wide for the rest of his life. Claire's eyes and heart, same with Ted, were opened wide. So Ted was living nearby in North Taunton, about 5 miles away from us, and he would come and fish, and he would come and we would talk, and Sean Rafferty, who I said was a great poet, there would be evenings down by his fire when they'd talk, they'd all were much more literary than I was. But of course other people came down too. Unknown poets like Seamus Heaney and all sorts of people like that, and Stephen Spender, and they'd be around. So you had all these poets around the place and writers. And they walked the banks with Ted Hughes. As indeed Henry Williamson had done before, the great man who wrote Tark of the Otter, and a much better book actually, Salar the Salmon. Hardly anyone knows Salar the Salmon. It's a much better book. It's the only book I've ever read which takes place underwater. The whole thing takes, can you imagine that? How close you got to nature to write an extensive novel about the life of salmon. With otters popping out, you can see otters, But he understood it, and Ted Hughes was the same. It's these people, and same with Seamus Heaney. He knew about his grandpa digging the ground, what it was all about, how the connection between grandpa and the soil. He witnessed that as a young boy. And to know these things and to have learnt it from great poets was a great sort of privilege, but I was conscious all the time, walking around, that these people had been here before me and been inspired by the place, and had gone back and written their wonderful poetry. So I wasn't alone.
No.
You know what I mean? I was alone with these wonderful spirits. I've talked a lot, I don't know why.
Well, I don't know how you've done it, but you have just led us on a journey through, that the reader takes through the book, and somehow managed to hit sort of everything I have written down here that I wanted to talk about. But in many ways, as you mentioned, the book is about quite a late spring, and you are waiting. It could have been called Waiting for Spring in a way,
yes,
because there is this thing. But this amazing moment, as you say, this thing of waiting for these swallows to arrive, does finally happen. And you make clear that, of course, they have been on this extraordinary journey all the way from the very bottom of Africa to rural Devon, and it's something that they do every year. And there's a lovely chapter, or lovely sort of section in the book, which I'm going to force you to read now, because it's just a really good example of what you've been talking about, the observation of the natural world and what it then makes you think. And you have some quite interesting thoughts about that migration that the birds are going on.
Do you mean quite interesting or very interesting?
What I course
what are we talking about?
Very interesting.
Don't come to Waterstones to be insulted, do you? I mean, yes, I will.
Would you mind reading that section, because it's just lovely?
I will. It's got a good title.
It's a good
chapter.
title.
It's called Most Acceptable.
Okay.
And I want to explain acceptable. It's a Devon expression which I really don't think outside our valley anyone's ever heard of. In Devon, they've got very much their own language, their own way of speaking, which is not just accent, it's about the choice of words. And it's very elegant in many ways, and it's come from years and years of what to say and what not to say. And they've got a very interesting way of just saying thank you. Well, thank you is quite boring, because you say it often. So what they say in Devon, whatever it is, whether you're giving them a present or would you like another piece of cake, and you say something is most acceptable. I just think it's wonderful. Most acceptable. Anyway, so the chapter is called Most Acceptable. The yearly marvel of the arrival of our swallows has got me thinking about migration. How migration is about need, the need to survive, to find safety, to escape, to feed and to breed. The swifts will be here soon. They like to spend the summer down the lane on Simon's farm at Bridgetown. They've always nested there, in the barns. You can see them too, swooping around the church tower in Iddesleigh, soaring high over the village green. No one has seen one yet, but they'll be here soon enough now. The house martins are about already, the yellow wagtails, the blackcaps and tree pipits, all of them migrating birds, all coming to us because in order to survive, they need a temporary home. Here, the next generation will be hatched out, will learn to fly, to grow up. How welcome they are, how they enrich our lives.
Fabulous. A very, very important observation. Just to finish off, you do mention in the book that people often think of spring as being a sort of brief interval between winter and summer that people are longing for, but that's to miss the point of spring. It would be to think of your youth as something that you merely pass through in order to get to age.
Yeah.
But it's a really important part of growth, and I suppose it takes us back to those saplings that you mentioned earlier and the kids coming to visit the farm to plant them. Spring is very much this idea of having the time and the space to grow and to flourish, not just the nature around us, but us as people too. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, the springtime of our life, we've lived it ourselves, but it's memory for us now. But what's lovely about it is that if you are lucky enough to continue for a few years, you have children. And you've seen them through their spring. And now they're seeing their own children through spring, and you're a grandparent. And then if you're really ancient, it goes on, and there's another spring beginning. I mean, we have a new grandchild about to be born in 3 months' time. And that's the springtime of a new life. And how wonderful it is and how lucky we are actually now. I think we forget how lucky we are. I think, generally speaking, I think we're living 10 years longer than my parents' generation. And that's 10 years when you can get to know your great-grandchildren. And that, again, this business of the seasons of life, you know, Shakespeare's quite wrong. There aren't 7 ages. Rubbish. There are 4. And it is spring, summer, autumn, winter. So will you tell Mr. Shakespeare?
I'll have words next time he's in.
No, and I mean that. There is a certain rhythm to the thing, and spring to me is very much, we've been involved, Claire and I, really, with people in the springtime of their life, all our lives as teachers. These are kids growing up, and they are seeing the world about them for the first time. They're going through the difficulties of growing as well, of surviving. Sometimes with some of the children we see down on the farm have very difficult beginnings. So what do you do is to protect them just as you would a plant, just as you put a guard around a tree to stop the deers nibbling it. And you check them, you look after them, you care for them, you do all you possibly can to raise them to grow to the next stage. And then by that time, of course, you think, and you're wrong, of course, but you do think when they get to summer, then that's done. Well, the truth is it's never done. And that's also what you learn about the seasons. And the other thing which is really reassuring to me with the seasons is that no matter what, they will turn around again. And we might not be here to see them, but that's very comforting in your old age to know that the children will grow up, they will go through the summer and the winter and the autumn of their lives. And I'll give you an example just recently of how my understanding of it has grown. And it is connected with the seasons very much. When we first came to live in Iddesleigh, Claire and I were very much when Claire was in the spring of her life, when she first came down there. So she really has been a little sapling, little Iddesleigh sapling. I came there earlier, but by and large, when we first came down to live there with our family, we were in the summer of our lives already. And so we've lived all our seasons, Claire and I, in that one village. And with each season, what you learn is more about the season that you're living through, and when it changes from one season to another. And for me, there was quite a big change not that long ago, and it was just after the pandemic. I guess we were in our mid-70s or something like that. And there were enough old people in the village around to convince you weren't the oldest. And the first thing that happened was our near neighbour, who we hadn't known at all, they came down to live from Yorkshire, came to us, I think just a couple of months after he moved in, and said, "Oh, we've heard that you are the oldest people in the lane." We said, "Well, maybe." So we're going to make sure that you're all right. And so, and it was extraordinary. So they came down, and for, must have been 18 months, they did all our shopping. We never left the house, never had to drive the car. They just looked after us. We're the best looked after old people you could possibly imagine, and we never got anything. But up in the village afterwards, and I suspect it was because people, the older people in the village were weakened by it in some way or other. Within a space of another 18 months after it was over, 8 old ladies in the village who were in the winter of their lives, they were all in their 80s and 90s, some of them. And we'd known them really, really well. We'd sort of grown up with them from the summer of our life. We'd been watching them grow older and grow older. And anyway, one by one, these 8 old ladies died. And you're walking through the village one evening, I would say, and the lights aren't on in the village anymore. It's just weird, you know. And you suddenly realised, hang on, that's where Joan lived, that's where Rosemary lived, that's where Gladys lived. There's no one there anymore. And I came back and I was very upset by it, really, by just the the fact that it seemed such a complete emptying of the village because finally a village is full of the people that you like and you love. It's not because it's pretty. It is pretty, but that's not the way you live there. So I came back to Claire and I said, well, I don't know how one can just go on living in a place which is still as a graveyard, you know. And she said she's very positive, my wife. She's very irritating sometimes. But in this case, it was very good. She said, well, no, things will turn around. There'll be new people coming in and new people coming in, and mustn't worry about it. And sure enough, I don't know how long afterwards, it would have been another 18 months, 2 years, or something like that. A light was on again in one of the houses. And we discovered that 2 people had moved in there, both of whom were musicians who played in the London Symphony Orchestra. And they come down to live in this place in the middle of nowhere. And one of them happened to be a churchgoer. And after a few months, went to the vicar and said, you've got an appeal out for your mending this and mending that in the church. Can we put on a concert in the church? And so the vicar said, yes, and you could get Michael and Claire to read some poetry and we could have music, and wouldn't that be nice? So they came to see us and we said, yes, we'd do it. So we arranged a concert where Claire would read Sean Rafferty's poems. The widow of Ted Hughes, Carol Hughes, would read Ted Hughes's poems, and I would read my masterpieces. And so we put on this concert. And I don't think music like that had been heard in that church, ever. Normally, and I'm not, there's nothing wrong with it, it just is how it is. In that village, the music has been us, about 23 and a half of us, trying to make a hymn sound as if we're singing together and failing. Or it's been a Christmas carol service where the organist loses the way and plays another verse and there isn't another verse. Or, I mean, there's always something like that. But it's not highly musical. And suddenly these people were there playing the most divine music in this church. And I knew then, that she's right, that things do go on. There is a new spring, and it'll happen. It'll be a different kind of spring, and it always is. So the old association becomes a new association. So Hardy was right. He was right about most things in the countryside, but unfortunately he lived in Dorset, which was a mistake.
I don't want to start a turf war between Devon and Dorset.
You better not.
Michael, thank you for leading us so expertly through where you live and through the season.
Wouldn't it have been great if you had Thomas Hardy sitting there instead? Wouldn't that have been great? Wow. Thank you very much anyway.